welcome to the Thoughtful Leader podcast. My name is Ben Brearley. I'm a leadership coach and the founder of Thoughtful Leader. The Thoughtful Leader podcast is all about short, sharp leadership advice because thoughtful leadership is good leadership. Welcome to episode 285 of the Thoughtful Leader podcast. In this episode, I'm going to talk about kind leadership, which is something that has been coming up in some of the things I've been looking at online quite a bit lately. And I think there's some misconceptions about this concept, so I'll get into them and how to make this kind leadership concept work for you. So let's get into this episode right now. Now, as you know, I trawl the internet looking for leadership examples and stories and hearing about the different experiences that people are having. And one concept that comes up quite a lot on things like LinkedIn and other platforms is the concept of kind leadership. Now, kind leadership is basically, as it sounds like, all about leading in a kind way, being kind to other people, showing respect for people, and almost using that as your default approach. So you default to being kind to people. The idea is that you really get the best out of them by treating them like humans and adults and with respect and kindness. Now, there's contrasting opinions on this sort of approach in that some people will say, well, kindness doesn't work because people are lazy and they just want to do their work and go home. They don't care and they're taking advantage of us or the company. And I think if you think about kind leadership as being nice all the time, then I agree, it doesn't work. Because being nice implies that you are going to be friendly to everyone, don't put too much pressure on them, be a nice person to get along with, someone who wants to be liked might be a nice leader. But I think that's taking the wrong approach. I don't think that's what kind leadership is really about. And the reason I'm talking about it on this particular episode is because as thoughtful leaders, we're generally more people-focused. We care about the people that work for us. So the kind leadership approach is something that will naturally gravitate towards. But there's a few traps with that, especially if you fall into the thinking that kindness equals being nice to everybody all the time. And it really doesn't. So on the topic of kindness doesn't work in leadership, I disagree. But to make it work for you, you have to reframe what kindness is. And you have to reframe the situation. I talk about reframing quite a lot in my articles on my website. And reframing is basically a way of thinking about a situation differently or putting it in different terms to come to a different conclusion about the situation. And reframing is the tool you want to be using for this type of concept, this kind leadership, because otherwise you might feel like doing certain things in leadership, you're not really being kind at all. So let me give you some examples of where kind leadership can fail or can cause misconceptions. So firstly, an example in leadership might be giving feedback to someone. So when you give feedback to someone, that might seem harsh, particularly if it's constructive feedback where you're trying to get them to improve. So you might have to tell them they've done something wrong, they've made a mistake, the quality of their report wasn't good enough, their behavior wasn't appropriate. All those types of feedback can feel daunting, and they certainly don't feel like you're being very nice. The second one is around managing poor performance. So if someone's not performing well enough and they're behaving badly and they're impacting other people in the team, you might actually feel like you're being mean to that person by putting them through, HR performance management processes or on a performance improvement plan and things like that. So those things can be daunting for thoughtful leaders as well. Sometimes I notice thoughtful leaders struggle with setting clear expectations as well. So basically telling people what you expect around a certain deliverable or setting a clear deadline for something that the person has to produce, that can feel quite demanding and authoritative. So sometimes leaders hesitate from doing that as well because they don't feel like it's very nice. You don't feel like you're giving the employee the freedom they deserve And so leaders can hold back setting clear expectations because they feel it's too directive. And another example is delegation. So a lot of leaders I come across, particularly of the thoughtful variety, will say, well, my team already have so much work to do. I don't feel comfortable delegating to my team. And so I'll keep the work for myself. Or it might be that delegation just seems like I'm getting rid of my own work and giving them more work to do. And I'm also shirking my own responsibilities and trying to get other people to do it for me, which doesn't seem very nice or kind as well. So there's some examples of where I think this kind leadership concept can work, but it can make us come unstuck if we don't use this reframing technique that I was talking about before. So we'll look at how to do that shortly. But before I continue, I'd just like to say that it would be great if you could rate this podcast. If you like this episode or the podcast in general, go into Spotify or your app of choice and click the 5-star button. It really helps me get the word of the podcast out there, and actually helps other thoughtful leaders because they'll get to see the podcast, or there's more chance of that happening. So thank you in advance for doing that. So now let's think of some of the reframing you might do for this kind leadership concept. There's 3 different types of reframing I suggest here. The first one is thinking for the longer term. So in the short term, if you were going to give negative feedback to someone who needs to hear it, you might think, well, that's going to make them feel uncomfortable and it's going to make them feel bad, and therefore that's not very kind, and therefore I'm going to hold back that feedback and I'm going to avoid doing that. But actually, thinking longer term is a solution to this challenge, because if you think of the longer term, maybe a year from now, or even 6 months or 5 years, you could think, well, the sting of that feedback will have faded by then, and that person will have a chance to correct their behavior or their performance because you've given them that feedback. So if you're trying to be kind in leadership, then you could say that the kind thing to do is to actually provide that feedback, because otherwise they're unaware of what they've been doing. They're unable to actually make any improvements. And so you could say you're doing that person a bit of a disservice if you're not actually providing that feedback to them. So this is what I mean by reframing. In the short term, it might feel bad. In the longer term, you can see that, well, you're actually stifling this person's growth by not having that difficult conversation or not giving that feedback. And therefore, you're actually, you're doing them a disservice, which is actually unkind. So if you want to think of kind leadership, then really what you should be doing is giving that feedback. So that's one way to reframe the situation if you feel like what you're doing is not kind. Think for the longer term. The second type of reframing I suggest is to think of the other people in the team or around you in the workplace. So you might go, well, that person's behaving badly, but they've got some trouble going on at home, and I know they're struggling with certain things in their personal life, so it seems quite unkind to give them that feedback or manage their poor behavior. So then I'd challenge you and say, well, hold on a minute. What impact are they having on the other people around them? So the other people in the team, for example. So while you feel like you're being kind to the person that is performing poorly or behaving badly, you're actually not being kind to the other people in the team who are going to be impacted by that poor behavior. So kind leadership in this case is actually thinking of the broader team or the broader people in that workplace or the customers who are served by that person, for example, and thinking, well, kindness would be actually giving that feedback to that person and helping them correct their behavior so that other people in the team can feel better about where they're working and can feel comfortable that the performance is being managed. So once again, another way of reframing kindness, think of the other people involved. And another way to reframe kindness sometimes is think of being kind to yourself as well. So kind leadership includes kindness to your employees and your team members. it also includes being kind to yourself. So let's think of an example here. Well, I don't want to delegate because my team members already have a lot of work to do. And so if I keep this work, then they won't have to do the work. So you're being kind to that employee potentially, perhaps. But you're actually not really being kind to yourself either, because you'll have a huge workload. You'll struggle to get your own work done. You might put yourself under undue stress. So you're actually not being kind to yourself in that situation, and you might feel like you're being kind to your employee. But then we can think of the other reframing tools we talked about, which is to think for the longer term. And if you delegate something that helps a team member step up and grow new skills and, take on a bit more accountability, you're actually helping them progress their career, which just sounds like a very kind thing to do, in my opinion. So while you're being kind to yourself, you can also be kind to the employee by delegating that work and helping them take a step up. So those are some examples I thought was useful to raise in this episode about kind leadership and being kind. So what I do believe is that being kind in leadership is a good approach. I think kindness sort of works with the whole thoughtful leader concept. What I don't think works is when you think kindness is just treating people nicely all the time and being friendly and nice and not giving bad feedback or holding people accountable. That's not actually kind, because of the different things that we just discussed earlier. So remember these reframing tools. Reframing is a really powerful way to think differently about a situation. And those things were think for the longer term. So for example, withholding that feedback, is that going to help your employee in the longer term? Probably not. So you're not being kind by holding back that feedback. The second one was thinking of other people. Think of the other people around that employee who might be behaving badly, for example. Are you being kind to the other people in that team by not helping that person address their behavior? I would say no, you're not, and you're probably causing a knock-on effect where they are going to feel demotivated. And the third way to think about kind leadership is to be kind to yourself. And you might feel like you're being a friend and you're being nice and you're being stoic and supporting your team by taking on all the work for yourself, or, agreeing to stay back late or checking your phone after 5 p.m., staying up late, finishing that report. But actually, are you being kind to yourself when you're doing that? And are there other avenues you could look at to try to be kind to yourself instead of just putting yourself under too much pressure and stress? So that is the topic of kind leadership. I thought it was a good one to include because it is coming up more frequently. And I can see why. I mean, a lot of the world events going on at the moment, you can see that a lot of people are looking for more kindness in the world. And I think it's a good way of thinking about leadership, but only if you use the reframing to make sure you're not letting people off the hook. And you notice with the reframing I did in this episode, it makes sense. It makes sense that kindness isn't always about being the nice, friendly person all the time. Sometimes kindness is holding people accountable and helping them develop as well. All right. So I'm interested in your thoughts on this episode. If you have Spotify, if you're following me on Spotify, feel free to leave a comment on the Spotify app as well, because I'll address those ones. Or you can go to the show notes page, thoughtfulleader.com/285. Now, on that show notes page, you can also sign up for the Thoughtful Leader newsletter where you'll get the free Thoughtful Leader survival guide. So I'll encourage you to do that as well. Thank you very much for listening. It's been a pleasure to bring you this episode once again. And don't forget to hit 5 stars on your app of choice if you like this episode or the podcast in general. Alrighty, I will be back next week.